The cold air of early spring dispersed slowly over the northern plains, as if it were being held down close to the ground by the smoke of the front. Along the railway line the soil had not yet fully thawed. The thin frost that formed overnight turned, under the first light of dawn, into a slick film of water. Refugee trains stood motionless out in the wasteland, the carriages like abandoned shells of tin. Wind slipped through the cracks and gaps, carrying with it the smells of engine oil and coal smoke. Jacob Rosen sat on a wooden plank, his knees pulled up to his chest. His mother's hand rested on his shoulder, her fingers trembling slightly from the cold and from the long, jolting journey. Inside the carriage, people hardly dared to breathe, as if they were waiting for a verdict they did not know the terms of and did not know when it would finally fall. The German advance was too fast. Dispatchers had been ordered to give priority to military trains. Refugee carriages were repeatedly hitched on and cut loose, like pieces of scrap that might fall out of the convoy at any moment. In a single day, they were forced 3 times to jump down from the train and walk for several kilometers in the dark along the tracks until there was space on another section of line to take them in again. In the columns of people, some carried children on their backs, some dragged suitcases containing documents and clothing. When they reached obstacles, the soldiers offered no explanations. They simply gestured for the civilians to step off the rails and press their bodies toward the edge of the wasteland. Jacob listened to the deepening rumble coming along the track. Trains that belonged to others. Trains that were allowed to move forward while the refugees stood in the cold wind and waited for their positions in the system to be reassigned. At the place where they were ordered off the train for the first time, a German railway patrol appeared. Their grey uniforms looked even harder in the morning mist. The soles of their boots struck the ballast with a crisp, rhythmic sound. No one dared raise their head to look at them, but everyone heard those footsteps. The sound alone determined whether the column would be allowed to move on. The patrol only passed through. They inspected the line, checked markings, noted down numbers. They did nothing directly to the refugees. Yet the air suddenly felt as if it had frozen. For the first time, Jacob sensed something that had nothing to do with his age. Men in this kind of uniform had no need to say a single word to alter the breathing of an entire crowd. The border closed quickly. Lithuanian checkpoints had sheets of iron hung across them before midnight. A notice on a board announced the authorities' decision: entry suspended. The reason given was excessive administrative pressure, but no one in the refugee column believed that. Jacob's father tried to push forward and speak, only to be nudged back with the butt of a rifle. The gate closed in his face, and his voice was swallowed in the noise of the crowd. In that moment, the atmosphere changed in a way that could not be ignored. It was as if the people, all at once, understood something without anyone needing to state it. This gate would not open again. Jacob watched his father shuffle back from the iron barrier, his expression stiff as if he had just been subjected to a silent insult. For the first time, a thought rose in Jacob's mind that did not belong to a child at all. Adults were just as powerless. They too were being refused by the world on the other side of the gate. The speed of that refusal was such that there was not even time to ask why. Heading north, they moved from market town to market town, searching for any line that still extended outward. The streets in Lithuania were clean, but carried a sense of order about to tighten. Grocers turned their eyes away quickly when they saw them. The doors of inns were locked before they could come near. Even church side doors had new wooden bars fixed across them. The radio began advising citizens to conserve food and to beware of deteriorating public order. Jacob did not understand politics or the implications behind those broadcasts, but he could feel a fear fermenting in the city that did not belong to the refugees. The voices were aimed at the locals, telling them, in effect, "Do not involve yourselves in the fate of outsiders." Soon after, they reached Kaunas, the last Lithuanian city that still maintained links with the outside world. In front of the railway station, queues already stretched out for several blocks. People held passports, birth certificates, old letters, and any other paper that might prove who they were, like fragments dug out of ruins. No one knew whether these fragments could be exchanged for a way out, but no one loosened their grip. In front of the grey station building, a figure entered Jacob's clear field of vision for the first time. He was a dispatcher from the Railway Administration, a German sent to help manage the regional system. He stood to one side of the queue, dispatch papers tucked under his arm, the cap of his pen stuck in his breast pocket. Cold, steady, and without any unnecessary movement. He did not drive people away or scold them. He simply watched, recorded, confirmed. Standing where he did, he himself became a kind of checkpoint. People grew quieter the closer they came to him. Their steps shortened, as if some invisible force were draining their strength and folding them into a narrower space. Jacob watched the man, and what rose in his chest was not curiosity, but a sharp, pricking alertness. He could not explain it, but he was certain of one thing. Men like this were more dangerous than those who shouted. They did not raise their voices, and yet they decided everything. Like the grey uniforms on the patrol by the track, their mere presence was enough to tell everyone that the next second might change. The morning mist outside Kaunas station hung unusually low, as if pressed down by the night's cold. The paving stones were damp, and feet left shallow, dark marks where they passed. The line of people wound along the curb, keeping a natural distance from the drainage channels at the street's edge. Some, exhausted by waiting, had sat down on the ground, but most remained standing, held upright by a discipline with no obvious source. There were no signs explaining the rules, but everyone knew one thing. As long as they stood in the line, there was still a possibility of moving forward. The first time Jacob joined the queue, he still carried in him the lingering sense of speed from the previous days of flight. He thought it was yet another contest for position, that if one arrived early enough, if one stood far enough ahead, it would mean a better chance of passage. The queue quickly proved that thought unnecessary. The line moved so slowly it was almost circling in place. Each time someone was refused at the front, the people behind did not advance very far, because those who had been turned back had to fight their way through the bodies behind them. Two currents of movement collided in a narrow channel. The air mixed body heat, moisture, and a faint metallic taste of anxiety. At the iron gate where the queue ended, the German dispatcher stood, Karl. His movements were extremely controlled. His fingers opened passports, his eyes checked the order of the papers, and his hands returned certain documents to their owners. His gestures were brief and neat, like someone checking which bolts were loose inside a giant machine. He hardly spoke, but each action produced a visible compression in the crowd. People fell quiet a dozen paces away from him, as if the air in that zone demanded a specific kind of order. When Jacob first saw Karl up close, his chest tightened to the point of pain. He did not know whether this man would lose his temper, chase people away, or use the implied threat of force to push them back, like some of the soldiers they had seen on the road. But Karl did none of those things. He checked, he recorded, he continued his work. It was precisely this lack of visible emotion that made the danger feel greater. Undefined, directionless power was harder to predict than open hostility. The first day in the queue ended in a silent dispersal. No one explained why. At some point, the line simply stopped. Dispatchers inside the gate exchanged paperwork. A Lithuanian policeman at the barrier made a broad, outward gesture, and the crowd dissolved like a receding tide. Morning light glinted on the iron, thin chill traveling outward from the metal into the air, as if the space had been split in two. One half where people were allowed to come close, the other forever out of reach. Jacob moved back with the others, feeling as if the world's edge had nudged him away. It did not hurt, but it was sobering. They did not belong here, at least not as those who would be admitted. The second time they queued, it was the morning after a night of rain. Water slid from the eaves. The ground reflected a scatter of pale light. The line was longer than before, reaching all the way to the corner where a pastry shop stood. The damp air made sleeves cling to skin so that every movement pulled at cloth with a faint sticking sound. People's breath condensed into white in the cold. Each inhale carried with it some trace of the uncertainty ahead. Rumors spread through the city that Soviet forces were drawing near. The radio tried to reassure citizens in an official tone, but the irregularities in the announcer's voice made it clear the news was not empty. Those waiting in line heard the tension under the words. They could also feel that the railway administration was moving to a heavier rhythm than usual that day. More staff were walking in and out of the building. The ringing of hammers on rails became more frequent and urgent. Every sign suggested that if the line was not cleared soon, it might be shut down completely by a wider blockade. This time Karl was stationed even closer to the people. He moved more often, his steps sharper than in previous days. He paused for several seconds over the papers of an elderly man, then finally handed the passport back. No explanation. No remonstrance. The man's body seemed to collapse a little in that instant, as if some essential support had been removed. He retreated slowly into the crowd, his eyes blank and stiff. Jacob stood only a few paces away and saw the whole scene clearly. He did not understand the numbers on the dispatch sheets. He did not know why that passport failed to qualify. All he saw was an ordinary person lose his chance to go on because of one silent movement. The sudden, clean denial ignited something deep in him that he could not suppress. He reached a second conclusion in his heart. This man was not simply verifying documents. He was choosing who would leave this place alive. From that moment, Jacob's perspective changed. Karl's smallest gestures became like the aim of a cold rifle, like checks before a silent shot. He began to see the dispatcher as a man carrying a concealed weapon, and the iron gate as the entrance to a battlefield. A refusal here was the stripping away of a future. No one fired a gun, but this cue seemed to Jacob more destructive than the shots fired along the tracks. Rainwater had collected overnight in the cracks between paving stones, making mirrors of the ground. The nearer they came to the gate, the more slippery the footing. Tension shortened people's breathing. Pressure built in shoulders as those behind pushed forward to avoid being squeezed out of line. Voices flickered into arguments. Under the pressure of the weather and the crowd, Jacob felt a form of oppression different from the terror of running along the railway at night. Then they had at least known from which direction the danger was coming. Now they knew only that their fate lay in the hands of a few men at a table. By midday the line dispersed again. Those denied permission left one by one. Those approved were directed toward another area. Jacob's family had not made it to the front. But from the rear of the crowd he could see that the space in front of the station building still maintained its strange, inviolate calm. That calmness was like a wall pressing hope down onto the wet, cold ground. The second attempt did not bring a result. It brought a deeper certainty. They were not lining up. They were waiting for an order they could not change. Everyone understood this. No one dared to say it aloud. The third queue formed on an afternoon when there was almost no wind. The temperature had risen slightly, but the air still carried the damp chill of early spring. Sunlight lay over the square outside the station, but could not disperse the darkness behind the people's backs. This time the line stretched so far that its end could not be seen, as if the whole city had come to wait for its turn in the sorting of destinies. From the beginning, Jacob was pressed into the middle of the line, surrounded on all sides by shoulders, sleeves, and unsteady breathing. Children's cries traveled a long way along the queue, then were quickly hushed by adults. Steps were more uneven than in previous attempts, not only because of the crush, but because everyone knew this might be the last chance. Stories of the impending closure of the line had spread through the city. It was clear to all that if the gate did not open now, they might be trapped there. Karl's expression was harder to read than ever. He moved faster. His actions were tighter. He raised his head now and again to scan the length of the line, as if assessing at what point it might break out of control. He paused longer over each set of papers, yet he spoke even less, offering no gestures to ease the tension. As the line approached the gate, a sudden surge ran through it. People pushed forward to avoid being forced out, and their collective movement spread like a wave. Jacob's feet slipped on the wet stones, and he went down into the mud. The impact jarred his chest. He tried to push himself up, but feet kept brushing past his body. Someone stepped on his passport. The edge of the paper tore. Mud and a clear shoe print marked it. That passport was one of the few documents they had managed to bring from Poland, one of the last physical traces of their identity. As he lifted his head, he saw Karl standing a few steps away, holding several passports that had been collected. Karl's gaze fell on him for the briefest moment. Even that instant of attention felt like a coldness passing over him. The dispatcher then crouched down, picked up the mud-stained passport, pressed its crumpled corner flat with his fingertips, and handed it back. He said nothing. He offered no comfort. He merely returned the document to its owner. There was no obvious malice in the sequence of actions, yet something in Jacob reacted as if he had been struck. He felt that kind of silence was crueler than an outright refusal. Adults might pull children up from the ground, but they would not reach out to hold their lives. Their movements were always precise, calm and decisive, like machines. It was that precision, more than any raised voice, that felt like a blade. The mud on the passport dried quickly into a dark, cracked stain, like a mark pressed there by time. Jacob stared at the jagged line and felt a weight on his chest. His fear remained, but another feeling crystallized alongside it. He arrived at a hard, unshifting judgment. This man would not help anyone. His silence, like his uniform, existed to keep them on the wrong side of a line. The third queue ended in a kind of suffocating stillness. The iron gate closed before dusk. Light traced a sharp outline along the frame. The crowd scattered yet again, but no one walked quickly. Before leaving, each person looked back at the gate, as if they were looking down a road with no exit. Karl stood on the inside of that gate like a piece of metal that could not be crossed. He had come close to the queue, but he had never reached out to bring anyone through. That proximity only strengthened Jacob's conviction. Not all enmity showed itself in motion. Sometimes it took the form of silence. In early April, the weather in Kaunas turned unnaturally still. The cloud cover was thin, like stretched gauze, and the light beneath it looked pale. There were few pedestrians on the streets, as if everyone were waiting for a decision that had not yet been announced. The air carried a tension that was hard to name, not tied to any single event, but made up of fragments of news. Soviet forces pushing in from the east, German advisors coming and going more frequently at the railway offices, prices jumping overnight, shop fronts being boarded more firmly. Silent patrols appeared now and then, a wordless reminder that some invisible line was tightening. In that atmosphere, the air inside the dispatcher's room was even more compressed. Noon light fell through a high window onto the desks, but could not brighten the hollows made by stacks of paper. Documents were sorted into categories: pending, refused, returned, postponed. Each pile had its place, forming a self-contained system of order. Now and then a draft came in through the window and lifted a corner of paper. The rustling sounded like grains of sand falling on metal. Karl Wittmann stood at the center of the room. He did not belong to any of the categories on the desks, nor to those whose names were listed on the papers. His uniform was as neat as any railway employee's, but his fingers trembled slightly, betraying a fatigue that had become constant. For several nights he had not slept well. He woke in the dark to the imagined ticking of the telegraph or to memories of decisions made under pressure. He picked up a new list from the table. It contained the names of those who might be applying for departure that day. The line was running at its limits, and the Soviet advance added new urgency to every choice. Karl knew that the mere arrangement of these papers already embodied a filtering process taking place. He turned from the first page to the last, his gaze cool, his breathing heavier than usual. From the other side of the office came raised voices. Two administrators were arguing over train allocations. Their words mingled with the regular tapping of the telegraph, producing a rough noise that sat underneath everything else. Karl did not look up, but his shoulders tightened slightly. He understood what lay behind the quarrel. As the Soviets drew closer, the Bureau would have to cut civilian traffic. Anyone deemed non-essential would be stopped somewhere inland and held for further instructions. Those instructions rarely came in clear written orders. They took the form of recommendations: reduce night departures, cut back border trains, increase identity checks, suspend confirmation for non-local travelers. On paper, it was administrative. In practice, it was a pre-designed closure. Karl pulled another stack toward him. These were names left over from the day before. He recognized some from the queues. He remembered a mother with a child on her back who stood for 4 hours in the rain, a boy who almost fell under the crush while trying to support his father, many others whose eyes had turned empty the moment they were refused. He could not match all those faces to the names on the pages, but their outlines seemed to flicker between the lines of print. He was fully aware of the system he served. In wartime, the railway was a weapon. Dispatchers were part of the mechanism. Every sheet stamped, every line approved or denied could shape someone's path. He could not change campaigns or policies, but he could determine where each page went next. In the past few days, he had tried to remain neutral, to see his role as merely technical. Yet he could not completely block out the state of the people in the queues, bodies and lives compressed by time and circumstance to the limits of endurance. The telegraph clicked out a new message. The operator frowned as he decoded, then transcribed it and carried the slip to the supervisor. The supervisor read for a few seconds, and then passed it to Karl. The words were few, but they thickened the air. Soviet forces have entered the Lithuanian border. Transport control measures to be strengthened. This was not yet an explicit order. As before, it meant that orders were on their way. Karl knew what would follow. Within hours, the Bureau would begin cutting departures. All those whose cases were not yet approved would be held in Kaunas for further processing. What that processing meant in reality would not be spelled out on forms, but its consequences would be final. He laid the slip down and tapped the edge of the table with his fingertip. Looking at the piles of paperwork, he felt suddenly as if he were looking at a corridor closing in. He knew who would be affected. He knew that the movements of his own hands could draw a line between those who remained and those who left. For the first time, he caught the thought in clear terms. If the existing process were followed, these people would not leave Kaunas. Not a few individuals. A whole group. He looked up toward the door. Thin light entered through the gap around the frame and drew a slanting band across the wall. It seemed to mark the outline of a border about to snap shut. He remembered the platform the previous night. Children being gripped more tightly in their parents' arms, women's faces marked with the tracks of tears, men's eyes cast down with no fixed point. He remembered the emptiness in the air after the crowd had been sent away. Not the sound of wind, but the sound of waiting. He separated the documents into two stacks. One stack represented those who might be granted passage, the other represented those who would be turned back. His fingers hovered above the to-be-returned pile. He neither picked it up nor pushed it aside. The hesitation itself revealed his conflict. He knew his official duties. He knew that adjusting the order of papers would have consequences. Any small irregularity might be questioned, investigated, written down in his personnel file. He did not need a direct threat from a superior to imagine the results. Reassignment, loss of position, accusations of unreliability. He also knew the other side of the equation. If he quietly stamped refusals, everyone in that stack would be trapped when the line finally closed. That loss would not be reversible, like a section of track cut away with no spare rail to reconnect it. He thought of the people outside the gate during the first queue, waiting silently. He thought of the old man in the rain, whose eyes had emptied in an instant when his passport was returned. He thought of the boy who had fallen in the mud and the passport whose corner he had pressed flat. These images had nothing to do with the wording of instructions. They surfaced now, layered over the neat columns of names. Finally, he placed his fingertips on the top sheet in the to-be-returned pile. The paper felt rough from repeated handling, faintly warm from other hands. He did not separate the stack into smaller parts. Instead, he pushed the entire pile further away across the table. The movement was small, but something in him seemed to crack along with it. A narrow, invisible fissure opened under his hand. Then he drew the other stack, the one marked for potential passage, toward the center of the desk. From it he pulled a blank dispatch sheet and began to write out the schedule for the day's trains. His handwriting was normally firm. Now the lines leaned slightly. Ink spread along the fibers of the paper, its edges forming small shadows. Train numbers, routes, departure times, destinations. Each entry had to correspond precisely to what would happen on the rails. He wrote slowly, but did not break off. The faint scratch of the pen on paper was barely audible, but in his ears it sounded like tapping in an empty corridor. Halfway down the page, his wrist trembled. When he came to the final entry, his breath caught in his chest. The last line was reserved for special notes regarding particular passengers. In that space, he wrote, "Approved for departure to Vilnius, further transit via Vladivostok to be confirmed." It was a legitimate administrative formula. It was also enough to open a corridor for an entire trainload of people. For the first time in days, he set his pen down, having deliberately stepped outside the lines of instruction. He folded the dispatch sheet and slid it into a wooden clipboard. His fingers rested on the board for a moment, then tapped it lightly, as if checking that the decision really existed in the world. When he left the dispatch room, the light outside seemed almost harsh. The air on the platform carried a kind of silence about to break. The tracks gleamed, stretching away like several thin lines leading into the unknown. People had not yet been summoned, still waiting in scattered groups. Karl knew that once the schedule went through, it would take only minutes for the platform to fill. He walked to the platform dispatcher and handed him the clipboard. The man took it and checked it in the usual way. He noticed nothing unusual. Karl stood nearby, watching the fingers that turned the pages, the fingertips brushing over the words he had just written. His heart tightened as if waiting for a sound. None came. The schedule was placed into the official folder. From the far end of the yard came the first deep engine note of a locomotive being prepared. The pulse travelled along the rails with a low vibration. Metal knocked against metal. Time seemed to reassemble around these sounds. When the train pulled out of the siding with its first surge and roar, the air on the platform shifted. People were called. The men checking documents began to speed up. Some ran. Some lifted children. Some heaved baggage onto the steps and then climbed after. In a few minutes, the station was filled with a kind of orderly chaos. In that movement, Jacob was pushed toward the carriage door, his fingers clamped around the damaged passport. He did not know what had happened or why the line was suddenly moving. He only felt the current of bodies carrying him up the steps. The carriage interior was packed. The air was heavy with damp clothing and unspent fear. The train started to move. Wheels met rails in a steady rhythm. The carriage swayed. Light at the windows drew out into streaks. Jacob, jolted by the motion, lifted his head and looked back at the platform. He saw Karl. The dispatcher stood there with the clipboard in his hand. Another official was in front of him, speaking sharply, his gestures quick and pointed. Karl did not retreat. He simply stood, as if absorbing a pressure that did not need words. His body was turned slightly toward the departing train, as though he were making sure it had truly managed to move. His uniform shifted in the wind. Sunlight struck his shoulder boards and drew a small glint from the metal. The glint was not bright. It was the worn shine of something used too long, yet still holding. Jacob did not wave. He did not call out. He simply looked at the man he had so deeply resented, and for the first time felt a fine crack open somewhere inside. It was not understanding and not gratitude. It was the unsettling sense of a foundation loosening. The enmity that had come so close to them that day had not moved forward to strike. It had, for a moment, moved sideways to block something worse. Train picked up speed. The platform slid out of sight. Sunlight traced crossing lines along the rails, running ahead into country Jacob did not yet know. Years later, Jacob made a life on another piece of land. The sky there was dry. In summer, dust lifted by the wind would hang in the air and then fall slowly. He lived in a low house with bright stone walls. In the yard stood a few rough-shaped trees. Life settled into pattern. Work followed a regular rhythm. There was no sound of trains at night, no crowds pressed together before iron gates. He taught geometry and basic engineering in a school, showing children how to keep a line straight, how to hold an angle, how to build a structure that did not collapse under stress. He rarely spoke of his past, not because he had forgotten or feared remembering. The weight of those years no longer cut as sharply as it once had. It lay at the bottom of him like a stone on a riverbed, its shape still clear, but no longer tumbled by the current. Only on very quiet nights, or when a question in class caught him off guard, did that stone shift and reveal an edge that had been covered for a long time. Once, as a class was putting away their exercise books, a student looked up and asked, "Teacher, why do you always say that sometimes a structure only needs a little force to change?" Jacob did not answer at once. He looked out at the sunlight falling on the ground outside the classroom, at the shadows from the trees moving slightly in the wind. He thought of the figure he had once hated, of the passport pressed back into his hand, still marked with mud, of the crushing silence in front of the iron gate, of the moment when the train had moved and the wind had rushed in through the window with a shudder that felt like leaving danger behind. He finally said, "Because sometimes a little force is enough to change the whole direction." The students half understood and half did not, but they remembered the sentence. For Jacob, he was not only talking about engineering, he was speaking of something only he fully knew. One evening near the end of spring, he received a letter from Europe forwarded by an old acquaintance. It was brief. It said that the train they had taken from Kaunas was the last civilian departure that day. After that hour, the line was completely closed. Everyone who had not yet left was trapped in the city and later swept into further upheavals. Some disappeared. Some were never heard from again. At the end of the letter was a note. Someone had discovered that the German dispatcher, Karl had been transferred back to Germany in the summer of that year. The reason was unclear. After that, his name vanished from the files. Jacob stared at that line for several seconds, his fingers resting on the paper. He was not surprised, and he was not exactly saddened. He understood something he had half known for a long time. The man who had stood in the wind on the platform had finally been drawn back into the machinery. His actions had left no visible trace in official records. No directive had changed because of his notations. His name had been erased like pencil words rubbed out and covered by newer text. No one was going to record what he had written on that one dispatch sheet. But Jacob knew that was not the whole story. He knew that one train had been sent out that day, that those aboard had crossed a line between life and death, that a schedule which left no mark in history had carved a deep, unremovable line in another person's life. He realized that he had not really understood that moment as a boy. Back then his view had been filled with suspicion and defense. What he saw was a silent German employee, an adult who would not truly reach out to help him. A stranger he believed would always stand on the other side. Only years later did he begin to sense that the action on that day had not come from warmth or from sympathy, but from a cruder, older force. In certain moments of crisis, a person may demand more of themselves than they do of the world. It is not the shining sacrifice of a hero and not a moral halo. It is more like a stubbornness in the dark, the refusal, just once, to stand aside. That stubbornness belongs to no faction. It fits no set of regulations. It appears sometimes in people who happen to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Jacob sat in his yard until the sky was dark. He did not reread the letter. He did not fold it and put it away. He simply let it rest on his knees, the paper rising and falling slightly with his breath. He knew that his own life had been quietly turned that day. Without that small deviation, without those few lines written into the schedule, he would not be sitting on this land, would not be teaching geometry, would not be watching children argue over which shapes were stable and which were not. Every timetable of his later life started with that one train leaving the station. Even after so many years, he could not bring himself to call the dispatcher a good man, nor could he call him a hero. He could not guess at Karl's motives or attach noble words to his choice. Had he simply followed procedure that day, it would have been another instance of demonstrable coldness. But he did not. He deviated enough for a whole carriage of people to slip through a closing gap, enough for a crack to appear in a boy's view of the world, showing that people could not be divided neatly forever by which side they stood on. Later, someone asked Jacob whether the world deserved to be trusted. He thought for a long time before answering slowly. The world does not get better, but sometimes people do, for a moment. And that moment is enough to save some lives. So he continued to teach children how to draw lines, measure angles and build structures, because he knew that the strength of a structure did not lie only in its obvious mass, but also in a narrow opening where the pressure could be shifted. On that day, on the platform in Kaunas, a dispatcher pushed such an opening a little wider, and for the rest of his life, Jacob walked through it.